Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly, and voila! You get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello, and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I'm your host, David Turetsky. And as always, I try and find some of those fascinating people in and around HR. Today, we're talking to John Sumser, who's the principal analyst for HRExaminer. Hey, John, how are you?
Hey, how are you, David? Nice to be here.
Great to have you. Thank you very much. So, for those of you who don't know John has worked very hard all his life. And the fun thing about this is he started at 8 years old selling donuts door to door, and he has not stopped since.
Well, I stopped selling donuts about 6 weeks ago. But
wow, just 6 weeks ago.
Finally diabetes caught me.
Oh, that's not funny.
That's the problem with a steady diet of donuts.
That is.
Yeah, but it was, I do want to tell you a little bit about that. It was amazing. I had to sell about 80 half-dozen boxes of donuts, which meant that I had to go door to door to 120 or so houses. And you don't make any money if you walk up to the front door and say, hey, you want some donuts?
Right.
So you got to develop the capacity to start a conversation with strangers.
Absolutely.
And that was powerful. And because I like working and I like having money. And,
sure.
And I was way better at working than I was at going to school. I started working then and I never stopped.
Wow, that's amazing. So our topic for today, which is one of the first times we've actually broached this subject on HR Data Labs, is the ethics in people analytics. Does it exist? And I think this is going to be a really cool conversation because we've talked somewhat around ethics in HR Data Labs, but we actually haven't covered it. So it'll be fascinating. So the first question for you, John, is, and this might sound very simplistic, but I think it's going to be important to talk and set some groundwork, is what is ethics? What are ethics?
I want to take a break real quick just to let you know about a new show we've just added to the network. Up Next at Work, hosted by Gene and Kata Keel of the Devon Group. Fantastic show. If you're looking for something that pushes the norm, pushes the boundaries, has some really spirited conversations, Google Up Next at Work, Gene and Kata Keel from the Devon Group.
It's actually a great question. For me, I have a pretty simple starting point for answering the question. Ethics is the continuing search for the answer to the question, what's the right thing to do? And that tells you, in that simple frame, it tells you that ethics have some variables in them that means that what might be ethical under one set of circumstances may not be ethical under another set of circumstances, and that how much you know about what you're doing matters. So as you get more sophisticated in your understanding of things, the ethical topics get deeper.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So that's the first thing. The second thing is ethics isn't the law. The law provides the bare minimum boundary for civilized behavior.
Right.
if you think the law is ethical. And if you don't think the law is ethical, in America, we have a grand accepted practice of ignoring the laws that we don't think are ethical.
It's true. It's true.
But generally speaking, particularly in the HR context, the law provides a floor through which you should not go.
Right.
And so that doesn't mean that it's ethics. It doesn't mean there are a lot of things that you can do that are legal but not ethical.
Right, of course.
And so part of the issue is, how do you parse that difference, the difference between what's legal and what's ethical? And one of the measures that I use in my work with the ethics boards that I'm on is the moment that you start talking about risk analysis or profitability or the cost of doing something, you've moved from ethics into economics.
Right.
And you've made the ethics decision whether or not you did it in a formal way. As soon
Right.
as you are assessing risk, it means that you've decided to go ahead as long as the risk-benefit equation is good, and that means you're no longer thinking about ethics. So that's the boundary.
And I think what we've seen lately in the conversation in the world, there's a lot of ethical questions that have come up and have kind of broadened the spectrum of what's acceptable. Even though we all may not agree to it, and I'm not trying to get into politics here. I'm just saying that the world has kind of changed a little bit on what is acceptable and what isn't.
Well, here's a great example of that. So the contemporary ideas of privacy were all formed in the 17th century. And in the 17th century, the population was roughly 2 or 3% of what it is today. So privacy is an idea that's rooted in the notion that there are places that you can go to be private.
Right.
When you have, 7 billion people on the planet, it's a little hard to find privacy because things are more crowded.
Sure.
And so the first thing about privacy is we have strong ideas about what it is, but they may not be tuned in with the world that we actually live in. And then the second thing about privacy that's interesting to me, I had a career inside of a very large engineering company, and when you made it into the very senior management ranks, the first thing that they did was hand you the business card of the company tailor. And you, from that point on, only wore suits that were made by the company tailor. And the way you told who was what rank was the quality of the cloth.
Interesting.
So the early guys like me got a certain range of cloth, and the CEO had his own exclusive range that he picked from. Then I went to the tailor to have a suit tailored. And oh my goodness, the guy put his hand down my pants and was groping to measure things that only my wife had ever measured before, because that's how you get a good fit. And so there is a fundamental trade-off between privacy and fit.
Sure.
And that turns out to be an economic equation that everybody answers differently, and that it's really hard to generalize what constitutes privacy in some sort of organic social way, because people are willing to trade the barrier for a benefit more often than not. And I have a group of people who think that the current youngest generation won't care at all about privacy, and another group of people who think that they'll care about nothing but privacy. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that evolves.
So we can definitely see that in the way in which we allow for permissions through technology. Some will give everything and some give nothing. But I can't say that anymore. I don't know if there's anybody who, quote, lives off the grid anymore if they have cell phones or if they have cable boxes in their houses. There is somebody who's always either watching or recording or doing something that knows what you're clicking, what you're looking at all times, which is, when we grew up, that didn't happen unless you signed up on a mail server for actually subscriptions to magazines, and they knew that you like sports. So you signed up for Sports Illustrated. They knew you like sports, and they knew you like listening to certain music because you called into a radio station. but that's it. And you had to do something affirmative other than clicking on a browser button that said, "Yeah, sure, you can save my cookie from this page." But now there's and maybe this is where you're going, maybe not. So you could tell me if I'm wrong. But I think we've given up a lot of privacy in the way technology now impinges, and some people think of it that way, but impinges on our lives. And we've kind of given it up. So to have conveniences, whether it's the iPhone or the iPad, or signing up for Google email, Gmail, and having Google understand who you're getting emails from.
I think it's more like the Taylor example than that.
Okay.
That this is not a pernicious reach of technology into my private areas, but instead, once media started fragmenting, right? The era that you were talking about had 3 channels and 20 magazines.
Exactly.
And now there's an infinite number of channels. I'm making my own channel. We're making a channel right here.
Yes.
And if you have a channel, you need to understand who your audience is. And you need to understand how your audience is different from other audiences. And we can do this today at a staggering level of individuation, right? And that's a change. But the driver isn't the technology. The driver is these brand new emerging channels looking for audience and looking to understand their audience and looking to deliver value to their audience. So the fundamental, while it feels like surveillance and is experienced broadly as surveillance, the fundamental underlying dynamic is super positive. It is the desire of media in its aggregate to deliver you the most complete and enveloping experience that it can.
Right.
And that does look exactly like an invasion of privacy to somebody from the 16th century.
Absolutely.
So here we are, and we're in a brave new world, but we've been entering brave new worlds as a species since the cotton mills in England in the 1830s. And so we're going on 200 years of moving into our wildest fantasies as the fundamental developmental thrust of human beings. It's pretty crazy. I mean, the amount of change since the Enlightenment, since the turn of the 19th century, has been unbelievable and unprecedented, and includes the fact that you can, not so much in the middle of COVID, but when the borders reopen, you can go to a certain transporter place and dematerialize yourself and appear in a different country across an ocean in 6 or 7 hours. Right? And that's wow. And you can do it even better with these sorts of media where the connection is instantaneous and the experience, while a little flatter, is of being somewhere else while you're in the place where you haven't left.
And I think that causes challenges to people in their want of simplification and maybe their want of slower, easier life, quote unquote. And less complications mean obviously simplistic, but it also turns around to say, look, if you have more technology and you have an ability to travel around the world in 6 hours, then it does fundamentally change your expectations around what ethics mean, because our cultural ethics aren't the same as the cultural ethics 6 hours from now. I meant 6 hours on the plane. There are differences in cultures, differences in ethics that we have to understand in those locales. And being a more global culture doesn't mean that those cultures will adopt our ethos.
Oh, I'll tell you, I did a talk yesterday for 50 members of very senior leadership at the Pentagon. And in that context, women are ma'am, miss, and Mrs., and men are Mr. and Sir. And it's very Southern. And so this difference that you're talking about, one of the things that's hardest for us to figure out in the United States is that the United States is much more like Europe than it is like a single country. And the range of cultures in the United States is vast.
Sure.
And so privacy, the amount of time it takes to warm up a relationship, what constitutes work, what constitutes productivity, all of these things that are at the heart of the ideation of people analytics are actually highly variable by culture.
Sure.
And so you end up with this really interesting starter ethics question in people analytics, which is, are you sure you're measuring my reality?
So, John, that brings up a great other question, which is, if we think about the world of HR today, what does the word ethics mean inside of the world of HR? Because it's probably different from what we first started, especially when you were selling donuts. What's the difference from then to now?
Well, so let's talk about what does HR do, right? And so very broadly, HR is the house in which policies about people exist and instructions for their implementation exist. And so HR, from an administrative perspective, handles and polices a whole range of behavior inside of the organization. And there are typically, as the organization grows in size, there are typically more and more policies that specify this, that, and the other thing. But what people who practice HR do for a living generally is make exceptions to those policies, because the policies appear to be black and white, but human beings aren't. And so I may only have 3 days of bereavement leave, but I lost 2 of my kids from the same accident, and it's going to take a little bit longer. And HR arranges the policy exception over and over and over and over again. What HR does fundamentally is arrange the policy exceptions. So the human beings of HR are the buffers for the workforce so that the policies achieve their intent without being unnecessarily brutal, because they're policies. And that gives you a sense of what ethics means. Policies are good,
right?
But the right thing to do may not comply with the policy.
And especially if the right thing to do is something that is what could be considered obvious. I mean, obvious isn't necessarily obvious anymore. But, in the example you gave, of course, a compassionate organization is going to give someone leave or a little bit more extended leave for that kind of a situation. But we've all heard of horror stories that have existed where companies get publicly, I don't want to use a bad word, they've been publicly called out for being inflexible when there really isn't kind of a good answer for why they couldn't cause exceptions. And it makes news for whatever reason. It shouldn't shock us anymore, but it does make news. And so I guess the question back to you is, HR should be because they develop the policy, they should be helping make sure that the policies have an ethos, correct? That have at least a heart, if not some compassion.
I think what you run into in the execution of HR is that you don't have any choice but to allow exceptions to policies. There is nobody who is so good at making a rule that it demands perfect adherence to the rule. Right. And so the greatest HR practitioners know how to navigate those tricky boundaries. There's a lot of judgment involved in doing the work. And the actual problem is the desire to make it a policy. right? The idea of having policy is almost inherently the complementary opposite of individual freedom. And so it's easy to imagine administering a world where there's perfect adherence, no tattoos in the break room or whatever the thing is.
Right.
But I remember having a guy working for me, and he had a very particular expertise. He was the only person in the world who could do a certain calibration of crystals, and he did it because I think he was part bat, and so he would close his eyes and he would do this thing, and it was super critical. The whole company would have failed if he wasn't there to do his job.
Right.
So whatever he wanted, he got, because he was indispensable.
Sure. but that's also less ethics and more business practicality. God forbid he's not there, the doors close, right? And, having been in compensation for most of my career, typically those are the people who you would not necessarily pay everything to, but you'd pay them enough to keep them happy and to keep them excited and coming back to work. But we all know that, that person is critical. They're on a critical list. They may even, and I've seen this, we may have even insured that person to make sure that, God forbid, if something does happen to them, they get hit by a bus, the classic scenario, that we have some business insurance to withstand losing that person.
Yep, that's right. And so now you get into the meat of this, which is that ethics are often situation dependent, and that the right thing to do in a given situation may not have anything to do with what the right thing to do was yesterday. Precedent may not help you. Policy may not help you. Particularly when we're looking at new arenas like people analytics or AI in the HR department, the unintended consequence of the work that we're doing, and it's everywhere, are things that you want to get your arms around.
Sure.
Right. So there's a principle that is, you should minimize whatever unintended consequences you can.
Right.
But it's impossible to tell if you did a good job at that.
Right.
Right. And so this is the fuzzy world of ethics, and ethics is a world where things slow down. Right. One of my I sit on ethics boards now, and one of my constant experiences is, after I've sat through the meeting and after I've understood the problem and after the decision is made, I realize what I missed. Right. And ethics is a way of thinking about things that has to account for the things that you didn't see right away.
Right. That's definitely true. It's almost like the error of omission in that case, what they haven't told you, could make the big difference between right or wrong,
or what they couldn't see. Right. That's a lot more likely to be the problem, because I don't know about you, but I have been blessed by living in a world where there are not very many people with bad intentions. Sure. Most of the people I encounter really want to do the right thing and really want to do good, unless it's inconvenient.
Sure. Right.
But generally speaking, it's people of goodwill. But if you've got, let's say you're making a decision about some kind of compensation question, and you're trying to understand the demographics of the group you're making a compensation decision for, it's hard to account for the relationship between compensation and family and capital structure. And generally speaking, compensation people have stayed away from that. But if you've got a mother who's the breadwinner in a household that's got multi-generational people with illness in it, their requirements for money are different than somebody who's single. And,
absolutely.
And if you want to keep them, you have to understand that piece of it and address it.
But as a long-term comp person, we have to firewall the decisions from that, because the acceptance of that employee into the organization is as that employee is, not the situation behind them. If we allowed ourselves to be moved, and there are moving stories that go with a lot of those issues, then we're probably not going to be able to afford the other people who deserve as equally a chance. And I guess this comes back down to ethics, where, compensation hasn't done a really good job, and I'll take a bullet on this, but compensation hasn't done a really good job of making sure people are paid fairly anyways. The ethics around pay equity should be pretty black and white, or clear, I should say. They should be pretty clear. But they're not, because historical compensation decisions have been so bad and have led to where we are today, with people of color or women who are disenfranchised by those decisions that have been made in the past, and continue to, because the decisions of the past are compounded by decisions of today.
Well, so let me call BS on some of that.
Okay.
We talked first about the indispensable person who can have anything that they want. And so for the indispensable person, we do consider the backstory. And there is some, right? Because if they say they need it and we don't give it to them and they're gone, it's on us. And so we do meet their needs. It's when you get below the level of indispensability that you can do this sort of accountant view of the relationship between a person and the company. And you're exactly right. That's an unethical way to run things. And we're going to go through a phase, because that has been so much a part of our compensation system, that we have disadvantaged protected classes of people. We're going to go through a corrective phase, but the other side of the corrective phase is not uniform policy. The other side of the corrective phase is adaptive compensation.
Right, but I wasn't saying, like your point before, which I totally agree with, that the world of HR policy does not have exceptions. I agree with that. I'm just saying that the application of compensation has to be as pristine as it can be made, with the skills and the contribution getting the compensation, not the backstory getting the compensation as much.
Oh, you know what? That's certainly a way of looking at it. And that certainly makes the job of compensation people something that you can do with a spreadsheet.
Mm-hmm.
But the job of compensation fundamentally is to match the market to the need. And it's not about the administration of precision. It's not even close to that. That's just a shortcut for lazy people, as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I think the application of precision in most HR administrative areas is a exercise in frustration. There is no precision in compensation, even though the numbers should add up. It should be a zero-sum game. It's 3% of a merit increase, or 2% or 1.5% this year on top of the current base. It is an exercise in frustration to try and make it a science rather than the art form it should be. So I agree with you there. But as a comp person, I would tell you, we try and make it as much of a science as possible, because the finance people otherwise will be infuriated by our lack of discipline.
Right. And so this is exactly the question inside of ethics. It ceases to be an ethics question as soon as you start talking about the finances, and compensation is right on that line. And so the question that you raise in your framing there is, who's more important? Our position in the labor market, or the happiness of our financial people? And if the bean counters are the mark of successful compensation, then you should go join the financial department and get out of HR.
And by the way, compensation people have been asked that question many times over the years. Finance would love to subsume them, but no, that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah. So there's always going to be a tension there, I think, is where we can agree here.
Absolutely.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking the subscribe button now. This podcast is made possible by Turetsky Consulting and listeners like you. Thank you for your support. Now, back to the show.
But that definitely brings us to the next question, though, John, which is, in the world of people analytics, what does ethics mean? Because as we've been talking about, there are lines of policy and there are lines of what's right. And in people analytics, we try and make it a science, but we know it's an art form. And so how do people analytics then deal with ethics and make sure that they're towing that line?
Well, I can give you some interesting examples. I don't know if you saw this, but last week Microsoft released their Microsoft Office productivity dashboard.
Yep. I did see that.
Well, it turned out that the Microsoft Office productivity dashboard didn't have anything to do with productivity, but it did have to do with how often and how intensely you used their software.
That's correct. So
they substituted keystroke volume for productive development, right? And in productivity, particularly knowledge productivity, value isn't produced incrementally. Value is produced in a chunky way that defies the sort of underlying cadence. And Microsoft took such a beating for putting that nonsense out on the street that they withdrew the offering.
They did.
Right? They're really good at the test balloon and withdraw thing, but that's an example of how easy it is to run off the rails in people analytics. And just because you can measure something doesn't mean that you know what that measurement means, and it doesn't mean that you know what the consequence of releasing that measurement into the wild is. And so
that's right.
I look at people analytics and I say, oh, this is a discipline that's in the middle of an ethics conversation.
It certainly is.
And the ethics conversation is, what can we measure? What should we measure? And what should our conclusions be driving towards? What are we looking to understand here? And then what's the right thing to do and how do you tell? And, in the case of people analytics, it means balancing the interests of the people who are being measured with the reasons for taking those measurements. And, that's like a titration process almost.
Yeah, sure.
Until we have been doing people analytics for long enough, you're going to have to build that ideation inside of every company and have unique constructs inside of every company. That's probably where you end up with people analytics anyhow, because it's very clear that what constitutes work in one organization does not constitute work in another organization.
But don't you think that that's where, and I don't want to talk about regulation too much, but don't you think that's where the government needs to evolve to be able to put some kind of stake in the ground? I mean, there is a definition of work from the government. The DOL runs that. We have the Fair Labor Standards Act, which tells you not only what is work, but very specifically by job in some cases. And we have Regulation SK, which just came out, which says any material people analytics need to be documented and made public for public companies. So is that one way where we're going to start to air some of this laundry and maybe get some public conversations going about what are the ethics around people analytics and what should be and should not be measured?
I think it's going to be a very long time before the government catches up with reality. I mean, that's that the technology moves. It's a difficult problem because technology moves faster than the law can understand.
Oh yeah.
And so most often, I think the experience of technical people and people analytics people is that the law constitutes burdensome primitive understandings of problems that prevent deeper investigation. And so you end up having to think long and hard about what the actual right thing to do is because the regulations get in the way sometimes. And that's where ethics really matters is if you decide that you're going to behave as a company as if law A was wrong or disposable or worth fighting in court, then you may be able to do other things, right? And so there's this interplay between the law and ethics that sometimes one's approach to the law allows for a better ethical conversation.
Sure.
And sometimes one's approach to the law precludes a good conversation about ethics. And so that means that the people in the thick of the ethics conversation have to be super aware of the way their contexts are evolving.
Absolutely. But I think that also provides opportunity. If things become more public, then the corporate culture becomes more public, and customers as well as employees can make a choice as to whether or not this is the company of choice for them, and vote with their feet, as it were, and be able to, and we can't all be choosy these days, but I think a lot of employees would make their choice with their feet if there were ethical issues that were raised by public statements by their company. And I think we actually have seen examples of that recently.
Oh yeah, there's a classic going on over at Google right now.
Yeah.
But I've been looking really hard at explainability recently, because the most interesting stuff that's going on in AI is completely impossible to explain. And so explainability sounds interesting, like transparency sounds interesting, but it's explainable to whom?
Right.
And transparent to whom?
Right.
And so my guess is that mandated publicly available statistics will be as doctored in this area as they are in the balance sheet.
Right. But as we've talked about in past episodes, at least on the balance sheet, there is a common understanding of what is revenue. Whereas in the world of people analytics, we don't even have a standard. I mean, SHRM has, and a couple of other people, ISO has some, but not many people have to follow those when they make these mandatory pronouncements. And at least in the finance world, they have FASB rules, which tell them what to do.
I'm not sure that highly visible top-level regulation actually means anything in practice. You can say that the accounting profession has well-defined, well-documented standards, but there is no meaningful enforcement of those standards. No.
Yeah, I've never seen companies get fined. Well, maybe there have been, I haven't paid attention to it, but being fined for providing false records. But I know that I've seen many companies restate their records because they found errors and issues.
There's all sorts of stuff that goes on there, but there are 7 million in the United States. There's 7 million tax filing business entities, and there's no way to regulate and examine all of those books, so that
Sure.
all that the quality control that the financial people in regulation can do is some sort of minor sampling exercise, and hoping that if they punish a particular wrongdoer enough, that it will scare everybody else into compliance.
Right.
And that doesn't work in the prison system, and it won't work in the financial system.
That's true. But I think what we might have to do, John, is we might have to wait a little bit to see what does transpire from the filings in 2020, and see, whether or not any of the shareholder groups, activist investors, or analysts actually pick up on SK and any of the pronouncements that come out, and see how they're challenged. But we'll have to wait on that, because that hasn't happened yet. I'd love to talk about this more. Do you mind maybe coming back for another episode?
Oh, no, we just scratched the surface here. We should do another one.
All right, great. Well, just to summarize what we've talked about today, we've talked about what are ethics, and then we talked about the application of those ethics in the world of HR. And then we tried to scratch the surface, and I don't even know if we've scratched the surface about what does that mean in the world of people analytics. But I'm gonna have you come back, John, so we could do another one and follow up on this. And hopefully we'll do that soon.
Okay, great. I'd love to do it, David. Thanks.
John, thank you very much. You've been awesome. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the HR Data Labs. If you like it, please hit subscribe. If you don't mind, please tell your friends about this, especially if they're in the world of people analytics and HR. And thank you very much. And please stay safe.
That was HR Data Labs. Please visit turetskyconsulting.com/podcast to review the show, add comments about this episode, or add new ideas about upcoming shows you'd like to hear. Feel free to be creative, but please be nice. Thank you for joining us this week on the HR Data Labs podcast, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.